I'm often asked how I prepare for documentary and nonfiction video shoots, and today I want to tell you a little bit about my pre-production process. My pre-production generally consists of 3 key documents. Those are a list of interview questions, a rough script, and then I have my shot list and schedule. In this video, we'll focus on building your A-Roll Interview Questionnaire. I know long YouTube videos can get really tiresome, so I'll give you a quick summary for those who only need quick answers right up front, and then we'll delve deeper into the process. The way I approach my A-Roll questionnaire is essentially by reverse engineering the story. Once I've done my research, I already know reasonably well what I expect my speaker to tell me. So I go through this rough story and I ask myself, what questions do I need to ask in order to receive these answers, in order to be told this particular story. Once I have my questions list, I highlight the ones that are most important, the ones that are less important, and that's pretty much the quick answer. If that's all you need for now, you'll find some more resources in the video description down below, and I wish you best of luck with your shoot. But I'm about to dive much deeper into the topic, so if you have a few more minutes, please stay tuned. Again, hello and thank you for tuning in. My name is Matt and I'm a director with Etherium Sky Films. While my background is in narrative film, over the last few years I've been fortunate enough to collaborate with a number of international media channels such as BBC, CNN or NBC on a variety of documentary content that I shot all over the world. Through that work, I learned that the production process, including the pre-production process, can actually be quite different from what I'm used to in narrative film. In this video, I want to tell you a bit about the process I've developed throughout the 200 or more of these projects now, and I will share with you some tips and tricks that I picked up along the way. For the purpose of this video, I will use my pre-production paperwork from a recent mini doc I shot for NBC about the whimsical nation of Molossia. This should help you follow along and you'll be able to compare my interview questions, my script to the final product, all of which I will link to in the description below. So let's get started. Any documentary project begins with research. Once my story was greenlit by the producers, I got to work. I read everything I could on the topic, I watched every video I could find on the topic, I contacted my key speakers, I had my little pre-interviews, and all of that gave me a fairly good overview of what my end product will be. So, if you're a beginner, what I would encourage you to do is at this very point, once you get through your research, write down the story that you expect and that you want your interviewee to tell you. So essentially what you're doing is you're taking a piece of paper or a few and writing out start to finish everything that throughout this documentary you expect your speaker to say. By this point in my professional life, I myself do it in my head, but if you're just starting off, this step can actually be very helpful. Once you're at this point and you have your little write-up, whether it's one paragraph or a few paragraphs, I would encourage to read it back to yourself in natural voice and time yourself. Because if your finished story is supposed to be 5 minutes and you end up reading this whole thing you've written out for 45 minutes, you will have to make some decisions. For now, let's say that you've written out your story. Hopefully it's just a little bit longer than your expected runtime, and it should be a little bit longer for one key reason: to give you options in editing. Later when you sit down to edit and you actually look at the material, certain things might work, certain things might not work. You will need the extra little bit to fill the space. I'm a director who severely overshoots, so for me it's not unusual to have 5 hours of interview content for 5 minutes of a finished project, but all that means that I have to spend hours and hours and hours, and often it's more like days or weeks of post-production to actually get all of that down into a shorter format. It's a payoff, it's up to you, and it depends on the specific project you're working on. how much more do you want to plan for, or whether you want to make your life simple and just, plan 7 minutes of story material for a 5-minute shoot. That's fair. So now that you look at your write-up, what you want to do is you essentially reverse engineer this write-up. You go through it sentence by sentence or line by line, and you ask yourself, what do I need to ask in order for my speaker to answer this or to answer that? And this is generally pretty self-explanatory. If you want the story to begin with, hello, my name is John and I'm the founder of this and this company, then perhaps you might want to ask them, please introduce yourself, tell me your name, and tell me what role you play in your company. So you go through your write-up sentence by sentence or line by line, you write out a list of questions. Along the way, you will probably also come up with other ideas, add them in, and pretty soon you should end up with a pretty complete list of questions to cover your entire story. But that's not the end of the process. Once you have your solid list, you want to go through it and ask yourself, can anything be condensed? Are any of the questions duplicates? Do you have enough, or do you maybe have too much? And there's no set number of questions that you should aim for. At least it might be different for each speaker and for each project. But some of the points of consideration would be this. How much time will you have with each of your interviewees? Will the person be excited to speak to you, or is it just a chore to them or something that they're forced to do by their boss for their job? Will they be standing or sitting? Will they be comfortable indoors in a I don't know, sitting on a couch in a nice chair? Or will they be standing out in the mud, in snow or rain? Put yourself in their shoes and consider some of these points in figuring out the ideal number of questions to have and to ask. This doesn't mean that you necessarily need to go ahead and cut all the questions to a minimum 5 or 10. Here's actually what I do. After my list is done, I will go through it and I will highlight the questions that are an absolute must, the questions without which I have no story, I have no project. And I usually try to limit myself to somewhere between 5 and 10. Again, it's a relative number, but that's what I use. Then I also mark for myself questions of lower importance, things that, okay, I can live without this if I don't get to ask it, so let's just mark it as if I have time, I'll do it. If not, then no big deal. One other thing I do before finishing up this document is I organize the questions in a more interview-friendly order. And for that, you want to think about factors such as, will your interviewee be nervous on camera? Will you be running out of sunlight? Will any of your questions evoke emotional responses in your speaker? If for any reason you'll have limited time, be sure to ask your key questions right up front. But if your interviewee is nervous or first time on camera, then do the opposite and be sure to give it time. In general, here is what I do. Up front, I usually put just a couple really trivial questions. I almost always ask my speakers to introduce themselves, to tell me about their job, their life, and so on. And I can tell you that I almost never use that, and I almost never plan to use that. Because I have titles on screen and because it's a waste of precious seconds, and especially when it comes to a short mini documentary. But I will still ask those questions for a few key reasons. First of all, it helps my interviewee get more comfortable with the process, and secondly, it gives me an idea of how they will be on camera. Will they answer to the point? Will they stray off tangents? Will they be very direct or not? Will they be nervous or not? And from then on the spot already, I can adapt my interviewing style as needed to end up with a better interview. By this point, you should have a fairly set questions list. And there's one more thing that I do, not necessarily at the end, but sometime throughout this process, is dividing my interview questions essentially into chunks or into thoughts or into sequences. In case of my project on the MicroNation of Molossia, I knew I wanted to ask a bunch of questions about the country, about the MicroNation itself. This was one of my sequences. Then I wanted to ask about the history and culture of Molossia. So that was my other sequence. Then I wanted to know something about the president's personal backstory. So that was another sequence, and so on. If you do that, that allows you to group your questions together. It helps you stay organized, it helps you save time in post-production, and more importantly, if you're running out of time on set, if you see that, okay, I already asked 1 or 2 questions from each of my sections, then it lets you know that you touched on all those key ideas, all those key topics. So even if for whatever reason you don't get through all your questions, you don't get through all your interviews, something runs short, some emergency happens, your camera breaks, whatever, then at least you will have a visual reference right there and then on the spot that you already asked these questions from these specific chunks, these specific ideas, yeah, this helps. So there you have it, your interview questions, or the first of the 3 pre-production documents for your documentary should be ready. But don't leave just yet. I will give you 3 free bonus tips to take away with you moving onwards with your project. So tip number 1. Do not share your interview questionnaires with your speakers before the production. Sometimes you'll feel tempted to send your interview questions to your interviewees. Sometimes they will in fact ask you to send them the questions. And my answer to this is almost always no. I say almost always only because in some cases, such as perhaps interviewing some really big VIP or some government officials, that might be a condition for the interview and they might simply refuse the entire interview unless you send them this material up front. There are different schools on this, and of course every director might have a different style. As for me, my answer almost every time is no, and here is why. First off, some speakers will over-prepare. What that means is they will memorize statements which they want to give you, and later when you sit down to do your interview, all you will get are recited little blah 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 without any emotion. You will be bored before you even get through the interview, and if you are bored in the interview, trust me that your audience will be snoozing during your end project as well. Secondly, sometimes I ask a question, but the answer that I get is of secondary importance. What I'm looking for is an emotional response. What I'm looking for is the little embarrassment that they show me, or the little shock that they get at hearing my question. And one reference I can make here is my feature documentary Love Market, which I shot with ethnic minority couples in remote north of Vietnam a few years back. I conducted many interviews for this film, and many times I spoke to people who have never been on camera before, never in some cases seen a camera before, and I asked them quite personal questions about their lives. And it was important to me that when I ask them these questions, that I can see how they blush, how they get shy, how they giggle, how they laugh, how they look at their partner for help, save me here, tell me what to answer. If I had told them beforehand, if I had sent them those list of questions, if I had told them this is exactly what I'm gonna ask you, I would get none of those emotional responses. Next, my question lists are a guide for me. If you're less experienced, do stick to your questions, but once you are more familiar with the process, being more flexible in your interview allows you to bring more life into your project. Sometimes speakers during the interview will mention some fact that I don't expect. Sometimes I will ask a question that maybe even I already discussed with this person beforehand, and they will answer something completely different that I didn't expect. And at times I might completely change directions in the middle of an interview. And for that reason, I don't want to confuse my speaker. If they've already seen a list of questions, they know where we're going with it, they'll be startled in a way to see that I'm suddenly pursuing a completely different direction. The next reason is that I like to conduct my interviews in a reasonably informal, personal way. Imagine meeting your friend for coffee in a very informal setting just to chat about your day, and you show up to that coffee shop and hand them a list of questions and you say, this is our script for the next hour, what we will be, how our exchange will play out. Aside from the fact that your friend will be thoroughly confused, it would be a pretty robotic conversation. I don't generally like that. Again, it's a different directing style for every director. For me, I like to make my speakers feel comfortable. I like to hear personal stories. And personal story doesn't mean that every documentary I make, they're telling me about their life. They might be talking about their work, but rather than talking about boring, dry facts, they would hopefully talk to me from a personal perspective, from an inner place, telling me what it means to them rather than just repeating facts. And finally, what if I wrote 50 questions for a very short interview thinking, okay, I got this, I will wing it on the spot. If I send this to my speakers, they'll just get a headache before we even meet, and that's simply unnecessary. However, all this does not mean that I refuse to tell my speakers what we will discuss. In fact, quite the opposite. So here's what I do. In case of Molossia, for example, instead of sending an outlined list of questions, what I do is I send over a list of topics that we will discuss. And for those topics, what I can do is I can have a look at those chunks that I had outlined before, the different sequences that we will focus into in the interview, and I can ask my speakers to prepare to speak on these topics. So for example, in case of Molossia, I said I wanted to talk about the culture of Molossia, about different cultural practices and what their culture entails. I told the benevolent President Kevin Baugh that I wanted to talk about the history and the geography of Molossia. And I also told him that I will ask him a little bit more about his background, his personal life, and how his background, how his backstory led him to starting his own country. And that was enough. Tip number 2, throw in some completely oddball questions into the mix. Ask your speaker what their favorite animal is. Ask them to tell you a dirty joke. Ask them what sound does a tiger make when it's being chased by a rhino. Ideally, have those oddball questions relate to your project. You might not ask them at all, but having a few in there helps you break up tension during the interview if you need that, as well as it helps you get a hopefully unique reaction, especially from a speaker who's not very emotive, which happens sometimes. And you never know, in your final edit, that's all you might need. You might need just a 2-second or 1-second expression of surprise, or you might just need to see them smiling. And these oddball questions can really help you with that without actually taking much effort or much time. Tip number 3 is to paraphrase your speaker's answers back to them. This is something that you can do early on in pre-production and preparing your questions, but even more so you can do it on set while already conducting your interview. During your interview, some people will give you fantastic, concise, direct answers to your questions, but unfortunately some other people will speak in a very long-winded way. They will go off on tangents and at times answer everything except what you actually asked them. I myself, I like to let people speak and get to their point, but sometimes I've had situations when this was simply not possible. 2 years ago, I was working in Alaska on a fascinating story with an older guy who spent a year in the wilderness without any human contact. And I interviewed him about his experience, and he was actually a really passionate person. He's a really emotive person, and his stories are quite fascinating. But the problem is that he speaks in such a poetic, fascinating way that it was very hard for him to speak about the key facts of his journey. What that meant was that even a very simple question such as, tell me how old you were when you moved out to the wilderness, the answer that I would get would be a long-winded 30-40 minute story leading up to that point, and in the process he would actually get lost in his own storytelling and forget to answer my question, which was beautiful and inspirational, but it does not necessarily help a filmmaker who still needs to put the facts together and convey this story to a wider audience in a way that the audience would actually understand. So here's a tip that I actually learned working in reality TV many years ago, specifically on American Idol and America's Got Talent. In any given day, we had some 200-300 people coming to audition, and we needed to build segments for each of those speakers. That was essentially like trying to shoot 300 mini documentaries every single day. Now, you might not think of reality TV as being very educational, but this is actually something that I still use until today in even my much more serious projects. So when somebody gives you a very long-winded answer, what you might want to do is paraphrase it yourself in just 1 or 2 short sentences and tell this sentence back to them and ask them, did I get this right? Is this what you said? If you paraphrased it correctly, according to what they said, according to proper research, then of course they will say, yes, this is true. At that point, what you will say is, okay, can you please tell me just this exact sentence? Can you repeat it back to me? And that's how you've just condensed your half-hour answer into a simple 1 or 2 sentences. Now, in your post-production, you will no longer have to cut individual words to piece them together into a sentence that actually makes sense, because you've had them paraphrase the sentence and deliver it to you right there concisely. It saves you time in post-production. This is not a golden bullet. In fact, it's more of a very last resort. So try not to overuse it, but at the same time, this trick has saved me numerous times before. And that's it. I hope you found some of this information helpful. If you did, please comment below and tell me what works for you. Every director has a different style, every producer uses a slightly different process. So tell me about your approach to interviews and to pre-production, and perhaps I also will learn something from you. Before you go, let me just remind you that in the description below you'll find my pre-production paperwork templates, as well as my sample script, interview questions, and a shot list for the NBC Molossia MicroNation story, and also the links to the finished project, so you can go through it and compare how the early pre-production gets me to the end project. I didn't directly reference the Molossia story that much in this particular video, but hopefully you'll still find those documents helpful in the other videos from the series. Which brings me to my last point, is be sure to also check out my pre-production videos about building a documentary nonfiction script, as well as your shot list and your schedule. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to Etherium Sky for more production advice, as well as for engaging documentaries and award-winning films from all around the world. Just to give you a tip what's coming, I'm currently in pre-production on a narrative fiction film called Things Which Do Not Belong. It's a story of a young man who one morning discovers a Soviet-era World War II submarine in his very swimming pool. This is a feature screenplay I've been working on for a long time. As part of the fundraising process, I'm currently building a board game based on the IP, and I'm hoping to release a small comic book series expanding the story. On the documentary end, just later this month, I'm headed up to Minnesota in the US to film a story about a colorful young woman saving foxes from fur farms and from abusive backgrounds. To learn more on these and other projects, browse through our YouTube, and as always, check out ethereumsky.com. Till next time.